Israel Keyes was born on January 7, 1978, in the small city of Richmond, Utah. The first of 10 children, he came into a household that was far from ordinary. His parents, John Jeffrey and Heidi Keyes, were strict and deeply religious. They adhered to a rigid lifestyle, rejecting many modern influences and mainstream practices. The family lived simply, moving often, and isolating themselves from what they believed were the corrupting forces of society. From the very beginning, Israel's childhood was marked by separation, secrecy, and rules that left little room for normal social development. When Israel was still young, the family relocated from Utah to Colville, Washington, an area known for its rugged wilderness. Here, the Keyes family lived off the land, far from neighbors, and practiced their own brand of self-reliance. They did not send their children to public school. Instead, Israel and his siblings were homeschooled, raised under the constant eye of their parents, and encouraged to avoid outsiders. For most children, this kind of environment might have offered a quiet upbringing. But for Israel Keyes, it became the foundation for something much darker. In the isolation of the forests and mountains, he began to develop patterns of thinking and behavior that would foreshadow the life of violence to come. Accounts from those who knew the family suggest that they had connections to fringe religious movements and even white supremacist groups. The Keyes children grew up in a household where strict discipline and extreme ideology shaped their worldview. Israel, however, stood out among his siblings. He was intelligent, curious, and fiercely independent. Yet, beneath this surface, he harbored a coldness that grew more visible as he entered adolescence. It was during these early years that Israel Keyes first began showing signs of cruelty and detachment. Neighbors recalled incidents that would later seem deeply disturbing, moments that, at the time, might have been dismissed as troubling but not yet alarming. Israel was known to take an unusual interest in hunting, but not in the traditional sense of sport or survival. He became fascinated with killing for the act itself. Reports surfaced that he tortured animals, tying them to trees and shooting them, or setting fires as a way to watch destruction unfold. These behaviors, common red flags in the early lives of many serial killers, were present in Keyes long before he reached adulthood. In many ways, the wilderness became his laboratory. Alone in the woods, armed with a rifle or a knife, he practiced the skills that would later allow him to stalk, capture, and kill human beings. It was not just about hunting. Israel seemed to gain pleasure from control and from seeing life extinguished at his hands. Yet he was careful. Even as a teenager, he learned to keep these darker activities hidden from his family. Outwardly, he appeared obedient and disciplined, traits that would later allow him to mask his double life from everyone around him. Keyes' relationship with religion also played a role in shaping his inner world. Raised in a household that rejected mainstream culture, he struggled with the constant pressure of faith and authority. As he grew older, he began to distance himself from the strict beliefs of his parents. He rejected the church's teachings, eventually identifying as an atheist. But this rejection did not free him from the effects of his upbringing. Instead, it left him in a state of quiet rebellion, detached from moral codes, and increasingly drawn toward creating his own rules for life and death. Socially, Israel was awkward. He did not form close friendships, and when he did interact with peers, he often came across as cold or detached. In school, related activities outside the home, his behavior unsettled others. One childhood friend later recalled how Israel once tied a cat to a tree and shot it, laughing as the animal died. It was not just cruelty, it was control. Keyes relished the power he felt in these moments, a power he would later seek to exert over human victims. By the time he reached his teenage years, Israel Keyes was already constructing a secret identity. He kept his darkness hidden from his large family and presented himself as another quiet, homeschooled boy in rural Washington. But inside, his fantasies of violence grew more detailed. He developed a fascination with serial killers, not out of fear or revulsion, but out of admiration. He studied how they operated, how they avoided capture, and how they created chaos while living double lives. These interests, combined with his growing skills in hunting and wilderness survival, laid the groundwork for what would become his chilling methods as an adult. Around this period, he also began experimenting with breaking into homes and stealing small items. For most young men, theft might be a rebellious act, a thrill. For Israel, it was practice. He liked the feeling of entering spaces without permission, taking control of what did not belong to him, and leaving without being noticed. These crimes were not about material gain. They were about the rush of intrusion and the secrecy of knowing he could get away with it. Each act of trespass made him bolder, more confident, and more prepared for the larger crimes that awaited him. As his teenage years drew to a close, Keyes began to distance himself even more from his family's beliefs and traditions. He no longer wanted to live under the shadow of strict religious codes. He wanted freedom. Freedom not just to live as he pleased, but to indulge the dark impulses that had been growing since childhood. By the mid-1990s, he had already mapped out a future that would take him far beyond Coville, Washington. And soon, the opportunity would come when he decided to enlist in the United States Army. The young man who left home at 18 was not just another recruit seeking structure and discipline. He was already something else, something dangerous, something hidden. Israel Keyes was a man who had learned to live with secrets, to mask his true self, and to take pleasure in controlling others, even if they were animals or strangers whose homes he burglarized. His early life, shaped by isolation, ideology, and cruelty, had forged the beginnings of a predator. And as he left his childhood behind, the world had no idea that one of America's most methodical killers was quietly stepping into adulthood. In 1996, at the age of 18, Israel Keyes left behind his secluded upbringing in Washington State and enlisted in the United States Army. For most young men, military service is a path to discipline, responsibility, and a new sense of purpose. For Keyes, it became something else entirely. It offered him structure, training, and, most importantly, a cover for the violent thoughts and fantasies he had been harboring since childhood. The Army gave him the tools, both mental and physical, that would later make him one of the most methodical serial killers in American history. Keyes was first stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington before being transferred to Fort Hood in Texas. He eventually served a tour in Egypt, where he was deployed with his unit. From the outside, his military career appeared unremarkable. He was an ordinary soldier, blending in with the men around him, completing his duties, and living the life expected of an Army recruit. But beneath that surface was the same cold detachment and hidden cruelty that had defined his adolescence. Fellow soldiers who served alongside him remembered Keyes as someone who could be both friendly and distant. On some days, he would socialize, joke, and drink heavily with his peers. On others, he seemed withdrawn, brooding, and cold. He was a man of contradictions, capable of fitting in when necessary, but always retaining an unsettling edge. Those who knew him well recalled his fondness for alcohol. He was known to drink hard, sometimes to excess, and even in those moments of lowered inhibitions, he maintained a strange, detached demeanor. There was always something about him that felt just slightly off. The Army sharpened skills that Keyes had already begun to develop in his youth. He learned discipline, patience, and how to follow procedures with precision. He became proficient with weapons, trained in combat techniques, and skilled in surveillance and strategy. What the Army could not have known was that Keyes was absorbing all of this with a different purpose in mind. To his superiors, he was simply another soldier fulfilling his duties. To Keyes, it was training for a darker mission, one that only he knew he would one day carry out. It was during his Army years that Keyes began to refine his ability to live a double life. He maintained friendships, went out drinking, and carried himself like any other young man in his 20s. Yet in private, he was harboring fantasies of violence. He had not yet fully escalated to murder during his military service, but he was preparing for it, mentally rehearsing scenarios, thinking through logistics, and building confidence that he could one day commit the crimes he dreamed about without being caught. One detail that stands out from this period is the way his peers remembered his strange sense of humor and occasional disturbing remarks. Some soldiers later said he would make unsettling jokes or comments that seemed out of place, hints of the darkness beneath his surface. At the time, no one thought much of it. Among groups of young men in the military, crude or harsh humor is often brushed aside as normal. But in hindsight, these remarks were glimpses into a mind that was already planning for a future far removed from military duty. Keyes' time in the Army also introduced him to the idea of structure as camouflage. In uniform, following orders, and living in a controlled environment, he could blend in seamlessly. He recognized that discipline and conformity were powerful tools. If he could appear ordinary, obedient, and reliable, no one would suspect the darker parts of his life. This lesson would follow him long after his military service ended, as he built a life where he appeared to be a hard-working construction worker, a loving father, and a quiet member of the community, all while secretly carrying out murders across the United States. Another aspect of Keyes' Army years was his relationship with violence. In training and deployment, he was exposed to weapons, combat tactics, and environments where aggression was normalized. For most soldiers, this was part of the job, something to be managed with discipline and professionalism. For Keyes, it was fuel. It validated the part of him that had always been drawn to destruction and control. He thrived on the physicality of training, the precision of weaponry, and the power of mastering tools of death. These experiences reinforced the fantasies that had begun in the woods of Washington during his adolescence. Despite his darker nature, Keyes avoided trouble in the Army. He was not a soldier who stood out for misconduct or poor performance. He did his job, stayed under the radar, and earned an honorable discharge when his service ended in 2000. This ability to function within strict systems without revealing his true self became one of his defining traits. He learned that, as long as he maintained an outward appearance of normalcy, he could keep his inner world entirely hidden. That skill would later frustrate investigators who struggled to piece together his crimes, because outwardly, Keyes always seemed ordinary. The Army years also provided Keyes with another kind of freedom, exposure to different places and people. While stationed in Egypt, he experienced a new environment far removed from the isolation of his childhood. While deployed, he traveled, observed, and learned how to adapt quickly to new surroundings. This adaptability became crucial later when he crisscrossed the United States, burying kill kits in distant states and blending into unfamiliar cities where no one knew him. Military service gave him the confidence to move without fear of standing out. It is also during this period that some investigators believe Keyes may have committed his first serious crimes. While there is no direct evidence of murder during his Army years, he later admitted to having committed violent acts as early as the late 1990s. He spoke vaguely of sexual assaults and possible abductions, though the details remain unclear. What is certain is that the Army years were not a pause in his dark development. They were a training ground. Whether or not he killed during this time, he was preparing for it step by step. By the time Israel Keyes left the Army in 2000, he was not just a discharged soldier returning to civilian life. He was a man who had mastered the art of concealment, honed his skills with weapons, and reinforced his belief that he could outsmart systems of authority. To the world, he was another young veteran, transitioning to a new chapter of life. But within him, the predator he had always been was now armed with discipline, confidence, and a clearer vision of what he wanted to do. The Army had taught him how to survive, how to adapt, and how to hide in plain sight. And as he returned home, Israel Keyes carried with him the lessons that would soon make him one of the most elusive and terrifying killers in American history. When Israel Keyes was honorably discharged from the U.S. Army in 2000, he stepped back into civilian life, carrying with him a dangerous set of skills, a hidden desire for violence, and the ability to live behind a mask of normalcy. For most people, military service is a stepping stone into adulthood, but for Keyes, it was a foundation for his double life. By day, he appeared to be just another man trying to build a future. By night, he was preparing for the crimes that would eventually terrify investigators across the nation. Keyes returned to the Pacific Northwest, spending time in Washington and later moving to Alaska, where he would eventually settle. But even before Alaska, his pattern of secrecy and deception was already in motion. Outwardly, he seemed like an ordinary young man, a construction worker who took pride in his craft, a person who blended in with neighbors and co-workers, someone who seemed to live quietly and without trouble. Yet behind the surface, he was experimenting with burglaries, arsons, and possibly even early murders. Investigators would later discover that Keyes had been committing break-ins and thefts for years. These were not motivated by financial need. He often stole items simply because he could, because it gave him a sense of control and power. Each burglary was practice, a rehearsal for the larger crimes he fantasized about. He enjoyed slipping into people's homes undetected, learning the layouts, and imagining what it would feel like to control the occupants instead of just stealing their belongings. For him, crime was not about money. It was about domination, secrecy, and the thrill of invading someone's private world without being caught. During these years, Keyes also began refining the strange philosophy that guided his criminal behavior. Unlike many serial killers who target specific types of victims based on age, gender, or appearance, Keyes prided himself on randomness. He wanted his crimes to be unpredictable, impossible for investigators to profile. He studied other killers and believed their downfall came from patterns, so he vowed not to create one. He would choose his victims at random, across different states, and in circumstances so varied that no one could ever connect the dots. This was the beginning of the meticulous planning that would later make him so difficult to track. His life outwardly appeared stable. He held steady work in construction, a trade he was skilled in, and that gave him freedom to move around. His career as a contractor also provided him with tools, vehicles, and excuses for travel, resources that doubled as instruments for his crimes. At the same time, he entered relationships and eventually became a father. These roles, too, were part of his mask. To neighbors and co-workers, Israel Keyes was a quiet, hard-working man who lived a modest, ordinary life. To those close to him, he could even seem caring. But everything about his normal life was a disguise, carefully maintained to hide the darkness beneath. It is during this period that investigators believe Keyes committed some of his earliest murders. While the details remain uncertain, his own later confessions suggest that his violence escalated in the early 2000s. He admitted to committing a violent sexual assault in Oregon sometime after leaving the Army, and he hinted at killings that took place long before his better-known crimes. Though he was vague about names, places, and dates, Keyes acknowledged that by the early 2000s he had crossed the line from fantasy to reality. He was no longer just practicing, he was killing. One of the most chilling aspects of these early years was the way Keyes compartmentalized his life. He could spend the day working on a construction project, joking with co-workers, or attending family gatherings, and then slip away at night to commit burglaries or stalk potential victims. The people around him had no idea. His calm demeanor, his ability to function in society, and his complete lack of criminal record made him invisible to law enforcement. He was, in every sense, the embodiment of a double life. Keyes also began developing his system of kill kits. During this time, he would travel to different states, burying caches of weapons, rope, duct tape, and other tools in secluded locations. These kits allowed him to plan murders years in advance. When the time came, he could fly into a state, rent a car, retrieve a hidden kit, and carry out a crime without leaving a trace back to his home. This level of preparation was unheard of among most serial killers. It reflected not only his patience and discipline, but also his obsession with control. Between 2000 and 2007, Keyes lived in several places, including Washington, Oregon, and eventually Anchorage, Alaska. Each move gave him new opportunities to scout unfamiliar areas, bury kill kits, and create layers of secrecy. Alaska, remote and isolated, would later become his home base, but it also offered him a unique advantage, the ability to vanish into wilderness or travel undetected. From Anchorage, he could fly to the continental United States and commit crimes across the country, returning without raising suspicion. During this period, his personal life gave no clear signs of what he was becoming. Those who knew him described him as quiet, respectful, and even reserved. He was not the type of person who drew attention to himself. Unlike many serial killers who display erratic or disturbing behavior before being caught, Keyes seemed to thrive on blending in. He worked, paid bills, raised a daughter, and lived in a modest home. There were no violent outbursts, no arrests, no public signs of instability. His ordinary exterior was perhaps his greatest weapon. Yet inside, Keyes was carefully rehearsing, refining, and escalating. His burglaries grew bolder, his interest in arson more deliberate, and his fantasies of abduction and murder more detailed. He studied maps, traveled long distances to scout potential crime scenes, and imagined every detail of how he could abduct, kill, and dispose of a victim without being caught. His crimes were not impulsive. They were calculated rehearsals for the acts that would eventually place him among the most methodical killers in history. By 2007, Israel Keyes had built the perfect disguise, a man who looked ordinary, lived responsibly, and blended into every environment he entered. But beneath that mask, he was already a seasoned criminal, capable of breaking into homes undetected, stealing without remorse, and carrying out violent assaults. The double life he perfected during these years allowed him to sharpen his methods while remaining invisible. The stage was now set for his most chilling crimes, which would begin to unfold in the years ahead. Crimes that would reveal the terrifying depth of his planning, patience, and brutality. Among all the disturbing details of Israel Keyes' crimes, one aspect stands out as both terrifying and unique: his kill kits. These caches of weapons and tools, hidden in random locations across the United States, were the backbone of his methodical approach to murder. Unlike impulsive killers who strike when the opportunity arises, Keyes believed in patience, planning, and precision. For over a decade, from the early 2000s until his arrest in 2012, he created a network of buried supplies that allowed him to travel anywhere, kill anyone, and vanish without leaving evidence behind. The idea was simple, yet chilling in its effectiveness. Keyes would travel to a distant state, often for ordinary reasons that raised no suspicion. Sometimes he visited family, sometimes he took a vacation, and other times he simply flew in, rented a car, and drove for hours. Along the way, he would bury a 5-gallon bucket filled with items carefully chosen for abduction and murder: duct tape, rope, knives, guns, ammunition, garbage bags, shovels, and bottles of Drano or other chemicals to destroy evidence. These kits could remain hidden for years, buried near campgrounds, remote woods, or quiet rural areas. When the time came, Keyes would retrieve them and put them to use. This system of preparation gave Keyes two major advantages. First, it allowed him to commit crimes far from his home in Anchorage, Alaska, ensuring that investigators would have no easy way to link him to the scenes. Second, it gave him flexibility. He could choose victims randomly, in states where he was a complete stranger, and then disappear. By the time authorities even realized a murder had taken place, he would be thousands of miles away, living his ordinary life again. Keyes took pride in this strategy. During FBI interrogations after his arrest, he boasted about his kill kits and how long he had been burying them. He seemed almost smug as he described retrieving a kit he had hidden years earlier and using it in a murder. This was part of his identity as a methodical killer. He wanted to be unlike other serial murderers whom he considered sloppy, predictable, and careless. His goal was to be the kind of predator law enforcement could never profile. Someone who chose victims not based on type, but on opportunity, and someone who left no pattern for investigators to follow. The way Keyes planned his crimes reflected a disturbing level of patience. He was willing to wait years before acting. He might bury a kid in 2004 and not use it until 2009. He studied maps, scouted neighborhoods, and learned about potential targets without raising suspicion. He preferred areas where he had no personal connections, ensuring that no investigator could easily link him to the crime. This randomness made him one of the most difficult killers to track in modern history. Even today, the full number of his victims is unknown. Keyes also developed rules for himself. He avoided killing in his home state of Alaska for most of his criminal career, believing it was too risky to strike close to home. He did not target people he knew, because personal connections often lead to capture. He avoided patterns in age, gender, and location. Sometimes his victims were couples, sometimes single women, and sometimes people simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. For him, the randomness was part of the thrill. It was also a way to outsmart law enforcement. His planning extended beyond the kill kits. Keyes was meticulous about covering his tracks. He used cash instead of credit cards when traveling, turned off his cell phone to avoid tracking, and often rented cars to keep his movements untraceable. He flew into airports, then drove hundreds of miles to commit crimes, ensuring there would be no direct connection between his travel records and the murder locations. He researched disposal methods, experimented with burning, dismemberment, and chemical breakdown, and took great care to avoid leaving DNA behind. Every detail was considered. What made Keyes especially frightening was how ordinary he seemed during these years of preparation. While he was traveling across the country burying murder kits, he was also raising a daughter, working as a construction contractor, and appearing to live a quiet, normal life in Anchorage. Friends and neighbors described him as polite, reserved, and hardworking. No one could have imagined that beneath this facade, he was orchestrating murders like a chess player planning moves years in advance. The kill kits also reveal something about Keyes' psychology. They were not only practical tools, but also symbols of control. Each kit represented a secret only he knew, a hidden promise of violence waiting to be unleashed. Knowing they were out there gave him a sense of power. Even when he was not actively killing, he could take satisfaction in the knowledge that his preparations were buried across the country, ready for him whenever he chose to act. It was as if he had scattered pieces of his dark identity across the American landscape. Investigators later recovered at least 2 of these kill kits, but Keyes admitted to burying many more. Some have never been found, and their contents remain a mystery. Each discovery was a chilling reminder of how long he had been preparing and how carefully he had thought through every detail of his crimes. One recovered kit contained guns, silencers, ammunition, zip ties, and drainage chemicals, all packed neatly into a bucket that had been buried for years. Even after his death, the thought that other undiscovered kits might still be hidden beneath the ground continues to haunt investigators. Between 2001 and 2012, Keyes' method of preparation allowed him to travel widely and kill without leaving a clear trail. He confessed to murders in Vermont, New York, Washington, and elsewhere, though he refused to give full details, often leaving investigators with more questions than answers. His system worked. For over a decade, he lived undetected, his crimes scattered across states, his kits hidden in soil, and his mask of normalcy firmly in place. This chapter of his life reveals why Israel Keyes is remembered as one of the most calculated killers in modern history. His kill kits were more than tools. They were the embodiment of his philosophy of control, patience, and unpredictability. Unlike other serial killers who spiral into recklessness, Keyes was methodical to the end. He treated murder not as an impulsive act, but as a long-term project, prepared years in advance and executed with chilling precision. And for years, it worked. He walked freely among ordinary people, his secrets buried in the ground, waiting for the moment he would decide to dig them up. On the night of February 1st, 2012, Anchorage, Alaska, experienced a crime so shocking that it would eventually unravel the double life Israel Keyes had been hiding for over a decade. Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old high school barista, was working the late shift at a small drive-through coffee stand called Common Grounds. She was a normal teenager full of life, with friends, family, and plans for the future. But that evening, she crossed paths with one of America's most methodical predators, and it would cost her everything. Keyes had been planning this abduction carefully. For years, he had avoided killing in his home state of Alaska. He knew it was dangerous to strike close to home, but the urge was overwhelming. He had grown confident, certain that his methods could shield him from suspicion even in Anchorage. That night, he chose Samantha not because of who she was, but because she was alone, vulnerable, and within reach. His philosophy of randomness remained intact. Anyone could be a target, and this time, the victim happened to be a young woman working at a coffee stand. Just after 8:00 p.m., Keyes approached the small, brightly lit stand. Surveillance footage later showed him wearing a ski mask, pretending to be an ordinary customer at first. Samantha greeted him with her usual friendliness, unaware of the danger. Within moments, Keyes pulled out a gun and demanded money from the register. Terrified, Samantha complied. But this was not a robbery. This was a carefully planned abduction. Keyes ordered Samantha to turn off the lights and hand over her cell phone. He then forced her out of the stand and toward his truck, parked nearby. Samantha, realizing the seriousness of the situation, tried to escape. She attempted to flee, but Keyes was prepared. He restrained her quickly, brandishing his weapon and threatening to kill her if she resisted further. Within minutes, the 18-year-old girl vanished into the night, and Anchorage had unknowingly become the scene of a crime that would expose one of the most meticulous killers in modern history. What followed was a chilling display of control. Keyes took Samantha back to his home, where his girlfriend and young daughter were asleep. This detail shocked investigators later while his family was in the house. Keyes brought his victim inside, holding her captive in a shed on his property. His ability to compartmentalize his life was on full display. To his family, he was the quiet, responsible father. To Samantha, he was a nightmare she could not escape. Inside the shed, Keyes tied Samantha and turned up the radio so his daughter would not hear her screams. He assured his victim that she was only being held for ransom and that if her family paid, she would be released unharmed. In truth, Keyes had already decided her fate. He was merely buying himself time, creating a plan to manipulate her family and cover his tracks. His calm, calculated demeanor in these moments underscored the terrifying nature of his crimes. For him, murder was not an act of rage or impulse. It was part of a system planned step by step. The next day, Keyes acted as though nothing unusual had happened. He tended to his daughter, carried out errands, and even prepared for a vacation he had scheduled months earlier. Samantha remained tied in his shed, terrified, as her abductor carried on with life as normal. That night, he returned to the shed, ending her life in cold, methodical fashion. Keyes strangled Samantha and left her body in the shed, hidden from sight. He then locked the door and boarded a plane with his daughter the following day, heading on a cruise to New Orleans, while the Koenig family frantically searched for their missing daughter. Her killer was on vacation, smiling in family photos and enjoying the sun. Keyes' level of planning and detachment during this time is one of the most chilling elements of his story. He had prepared for the abduction, carried it out with precision, and then slipped seamlessly back into the role of father and boyfriend. The contrast between his actions as a family man and his hidden identity as a predator highlights the disturbing duality of his life. For 2 weeks, Samantha's body remained in the shed while Keyes traveled the country, confident that no one suspected him. But Keyes was not finished. Upon returning to Anchorage, he devised a plan to manipulate Samantha's family. He staged a ransom demand, attempting to extort money while concealing the fact that Samantha was already dead. In a cruel twist, he used her cell phone to send messages designed to make it appear as though she was still alive. He crafted a ransom note, complete with a photograph of Samantha, which he forced her to pose for before her death. In the picture, she appeared to be alive, but in reality, she had already been killed. Keyes sewed her eyes open to create the illusion of life, a detail so horrifying that it haunted investigators and her family alike. The ransom note demanded money to be deposited into Samantha's account. Keyes then used her debit card across several states as he traveled, confident he could outmaneuver law enforcement. But this decision would ultimately lead to his downfall. While he was skilled at avoiding detection, The use of the debit card created a trail investigators could follow. Each withdrawal brought them closer to identifying and capturing him. For the Koenig family, those weeks were a nightmare of hope and despair. They believed that paying the ransom might save Samantha, unaware that she had already been killed the day after her abduction. The cruelty of Kai's deception remains one of the most painful aspects of the case. He manipulated not only Samantha, but also the people who loved her most, prolonging their suffering while using her memory to cover his tracks. The abduction of Samantha Koenig marked a turning point in Keyes' criminal career. For years, he had killed across the country without attracting attention. But by targeting someone in his own community, he took a risk he had always avoided. That risk, combined with his reliance on Samantha's debit card, would unravel the careful system he had built. The predator, who believed himself untouchable, was about to make the mistakes that would bring his hidden life into the light. The abduction of Samantha Koenig was the beginning of a nightmare, but her murder revealed the full scope of Israel Kai's cruelty and control. What makes this case stand out is not only the violence of the act itself, but the disturbing calmness with which Keyes committed it. He treated her death not as a crime of passion or impulse, but as part of a carefully constructed plan. For him, murder was a project, something to be executed with precision, deception, and patience. On the night of February 1st, 2012, after forcing Samantha into his truck and bringing her back to his home, Keyes tied her up in the shed on his property. His girlfriend and young daughter were asleep inside the house just steps away. To mask Samantha's cries, he turned up the radio in the shed, drowning out any sound that might alert his family. This chilling detail illustrates how compartmentalized Keyes' life had become. To his family, he was the same quiet, responsible man. But just beyond their walls, he was holding a terrified teenager hostage, preparing for the act he had fantasized about for years. That night, Keyes spoke to Samantha and tried to convince her that her kidnapping was temporary. He told her she was being held for ransom and that if her family paid, she would be released unharmed. Samantha, clinging to hope, believed that her life might be spared. But this was a cruel deception. Keyes had already decided she would not leave the shed alive. His calm, calculated tone lulled her into a false sense of security while he mapped out her death. The following day, Keyes went about his life as though nothing had happened. He tended to his daughter, ran errands, and even prepared for a cruise trip he had planned in advance. All the while, Samantha remained tied in the shed, terrified and helpless. When Keyes returned, he sexually assaulted her before strangling her to death. For him, this was not a moment of chaos or rage. It was methodical. He did what he had come to do, calmly extinguishing her life before locking the shed and walking away. Keyes' next actions revealed just how detached and calculated he truly was. The morning after Samantha's murder, he boarded a plane with his daughter, leaving Anchorage for New Orleans. From there, they embarked on a cruise, enjoying sunny weather, fine dining, and family activities. Photographs from this vacation show Keyes smiling, blending in with other tourists, appearing every bit the ordinary father. Few could have imagined that while he sipped drinks on the deck of a cruise ship, the body of an 18-year-old girl lay frozen in a shed thousands of miles away. For 2 weeks, Samantha's body remained there, hidden and untouched. When Keyes returned from his trip, he resumed his gruesome project. He retrieved Samantha's body from the shed, carefully thawed it using heaters, and staged it to appear as though she was still alive. He sewed her eyelids open with fishing line, making her look awake, and posed her for a photograph. The image would later be attached to a ransom note sent to her family, demanding money in exchange for her supposed safe return. The cruelty of this act is almost unimaginable. Samantha's family, desperate for hope, believed their daughter was still alive. They followed the ransom instructions, depositing money into her account, unaware that she had been dead since the day after her abduction. For Keyes, the ransom was never about Samantha's survival. It was about money, manipulation, and the thrill of deception. He enjoyed not only taking a life, but also controlling the emotions of those left behind. With the ransom in place, Keyes began using Samantha's debit card to withdraw money as he traveled. He withdrew cash in Alaska, then in Arizona, New Mexico, and finally Texas, each withdrawal recorded on surveillance cameras. He wore disguises, a mask, sunglasses, or a hood, to avoid being identified, but the trail was forming. The very thing that gave him power, Samantha's debit card, would become the clue that led investigators straight to him. During this time, the Koenig family endured agony. They clung to the hope that Samantha was still alive, desperately following every instruction in the ransom note. Each withdrawal from her account gave them brief reassurance that their daughter might still be safe. In reality, every transaction was a cruel illusion. Keyes had killed her within 24 hours of her abduction. The family's suffering was prolonged only by his cold manipulation. What stands out about this crime is not only its brutality, but also the way it exposed cracks in Keyes' system. For over a decade, he had prided himself on his meticulous methods: random victims, distant locations, buried kill kits, and clean escapes. But by choosing to abduct and kill in Anchorage, his own community, he broke one of his most important rules. He always avoided local victims because he knew it increased the risk of capture. With Samantha, he ignored his own philosophy, and that mistake would prove fatal to his freedom. The use of the debit card was another misstep. For years, Keyes had avoided leaving trails, carefully paying in cash, turning off his phone, and concealing his tracks. But in his desire to manipulate the Koenig family and extract money, he relied on a method that was easy for law enforcement to trace. Every withdrawal, every ATM camera image, every electronic record pulled investigators closer. The very thing that gave him control would lead to his downfall. By March 2012, as Keyes drove across the southern United States, law enforcement agencies were tracking the ATM withdrawals tied to Samantha's account. Surveillance images showed a man in disguise, but his build, his mannerisms, and his vehicle began to narrow the search. The mask of normalcy he had worn for so long was beginning to slip. The murder of Samantha Koenig was not Israel Keyes' first crime, nor was it his most carefully planned, but it became the one that ended his decade-long reign of terror, his cruelty toward Samantha and her family, his arrogance in thinking he could outsmart investigators, and his decision to break his own rules all combined to expose him. What he saw as just another act of control turned into the unraveling of his carefully constructed system. For Samantha's family, the truth was devastating. The girl they hoped to rescue was already gone. Their suffering had been prolonged by Keyes' manipulation, and the photograph that once gave them hope became a haunting symbol of his cruelty. For investigators, Samantha's case was the key that unlocked the mystery of Israel Keyes, a man who had spent years hiding in plain sight, killing across the country with no one the wiser. By March of 2012, Israel Keyes' carefully constructed double life was beginning to collapse. For over a decade, he had crisscrossed the United States, killing at random, burying kill kits, and returning years later to claim them. His meticulous planning had kept him hidden from law enforcement, family, and friends alike. But Samantha Koenig's abduction and murder changed everything. The ransom demands, the ATM withdrawals, and the decision to strike in his own city left a trail of evidence that investigators quickly seized upon. As Samantha's family deposited money into her account, Keyes began traveling across the country using her debit card at ATMs along the way. He was confident his disguises, hoodies, masks, sunglasses, would keep him safe. But surveillance cameras captured his movements, and investigators noticed patterns: the same rental car, the same white Ford Focus, and the same physical build. Piece by piece, the net was tightening around him. The FBI, working with local police in multiple states, tracked the ATM transactions from Alaska through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. By early March, they had a strong lead. Keyes was driving a white rental car linked to the withdrawals. On March 13, 2012, in the small town of Lufkin, Texas, a patrol officer spotted the vehicle parked at a hotel. Keyes was followed discreetly, and when he ran a stop sign later that day, officers made their move. Inside the car, investigators found Samantha Koenig's debit card, her phone, and other incriminating items. It was the break they had been waiting for. Israel Keyes, the man who had spent years perfecting his anonymity, was finally in custody. The arrest was quiet, without resistance, but the investigation that followed would reveal horrors far beyond what anyone expected. At first, Keyes denied involvement. He was calm, controlled, and polite with investigators. But over the days and weeks that followed, his mask began to crack. The evidence was undeniable. Faced with the reality of what they had found, he eventually admitted to abducting and killing Samantha. But his confession didn't stop there. In fact, it was only the beginning. Keyes told investigators that Samantha was not his first victim. With chilling detachment, he described years of crimes committed across the country. He revealed the existence of his kill kits, containers filled with weapons, tools, and supplies that he had buried in remote locations years in advance. He would fly into a city, rent a car, dig up a kit, and then search for a victim. After the murder, he would dispose of the body, rebury, or hide the tools, and return home as though nothing had happened. These revelations stunned law enforcement. They were dealing with someone unlike most serial killers. Keyes had no clear victim type. He targeted men, women, young, old couples, strangers. His only rule was randomness. He killed when the opportunity arose, often far from his home, ensuring there were no connections between him and his victims. It was a system designed to keep him invisible, and for more than a decade, it worked. In custody, Keyes was both cooperative and controlling. He offered details about his crimes, but on his own terms. He set conditions for what he would reveal, often demanding coffee, cigars, or specific news coverage of his case. He enjoyed the game of power, the ability to hold information that others desperately wanted. Investigators had to carefully navigate his moods, knowing that any misstep could cause him to shut down. Still, the information he did provide was staggering. He admitted to at least 11 murders, though investigators believe the number could be far higher. He described in detail the murder of Bill and Lorraine Currier, a couple from Vermont he killed in 2011 after breaking into their home. He confessed to attacks in Washington, Oregon, New York, and Texas. He spoke of bodies disposed of in lakes, rivers, and remote woods. But he refused to provide names, leaving families without closure and investigators without complete answers. Keyes seemed to relish his control over the narrative. He enjoyed watching investigators squirm as he hinted at details but withheld specifics. At times, he would grow animated, describing his methods with pride. Other times, he would shut down, smirking as if to remind them that he alone held the full truth. For him, confession was not about guilt or remorse. It was another stage in the game he had been playing for years. The most haunting aspect of these interviews was Keyes' lack of emotion. He described his crimes in the same tone others might use to recount errands or chores. Murder, for him, was a project to plan and execute, not a crime of passion. He had no empathy for his victims, no sorrow for the families left behind. His only concern was his own legacy and the control he could maintain, even from behind bars. Meanwhile, in Alaska, the truth about Samantha Koenig's fate came to light. Keyes confessed that he had killed her the day after the abduction, long before the ransom note was sent. He explained how he staged the photograph, sewing her eyes open to create the illusion of life. The revelation devastated Samantha's family, confirming their worst fears and exposing the depth of Keyes' cruelty. For investigators, the case became both a breakthrough and a frustration. They had finally caught Israel Keyes, but they knew the full extent of his crimes might never be uncovered. His random victim selection, his use of remote disposal sites, and his refusal to share names meant that many of his victims could remain unknown forever. Still, his capture marked the end of his reign of terror. For more than a decade, he had lived a double life: father, boyfriend, soldier, and construction worker on one side, predator, manipulator, and killer on the other. But in March 2012, the two worlds collided. The man who believed he could outsmart everyone, who thought he could kill without consequence, was finally behind bars. In the months that followed, investigators worked tirelessly to extract as much information as they could. Keyes continued to talk, but always on his terms. He demanded media silence, refusing to provide details unless his case stayed out of the news. He insisted on certain comforts, testing the patience of those who sought justice for his victims. Each interaction reminded investigators that Israel Keyes was still playing a game, even as he sat in chains. The capture of Israel Keyes was a turning point, not just for the Koenig case, but for law enforcement nationwide. It revealed the existence of a predator who had traveled coast to coast, killing at random, leaving behind little evidence, and evading detection for years. His confession painted a chilling portrait of a man who had no conscience, no pattern, and no boundaries. For the families of the missing, it opened a haunting question: could their loved ones have crossed paths with Israel Keyes? Could the disappearance of a father, a daughter, a couple on vacation, or a hiker in the woods be connected to him? The uncertainty still lingers. When investigators began to unravel the full story of Israel Keyes, one of the most chilling discoveries was the existence of his kill kits. These were not makeshift tools hastily assembled in the heat of the moment. They were meticulously prepared caches, hidden years in advance, buried in remote locations across the United States. Inside these kits, Keyes placed duct tape, zip ties, guns, silencers, ropes, knives, cash, and other supplies. Each kit was designed to allow him to strike at any time, in any place, without leaving a trace. The very existence of these kits revealed how methodical and long-term his planning was. Unlike most killers who acted on impulse or opportunity, Keyes treated murder like a military operation. He would bury a kit in one state, sometimes years before using it, then return when he was ready to kill. The kit gave him everything he needed to abduct, restrain, and kill his victim, and then dispose of the evidence. It was a system built on patience and discipline. One of the most notorious kill kits was found in Vermont, buried near the home of Bill and Lorraine Currier. In 2011, Keyes had flown from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, and driven more than 1,000 miles to Vermont. Using the kit he had hidden years earlier, He broke into the Currier's home in the middle of the night. He bound the couple, forced them into his car, and drove them to an abandoned farmhouse. There, he killed them and concealed their bodies. To this day, their remains have never been found. The Currier case highlighted the sheer randomness of Keyes' crimes. He had no personal connection to the couple. He didn't know their names or who they were before targeting them. They were simply convenient victims, ordinary people living ordinary lives who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This randomness made his crimes incredibly difficult to connect. Unlike serial killers who focus on a particular victim type, Keyes broke all the patterns investigators relied upon. Kill kits were found in several states, including Alaska and New York. Investigators believe there may be dozens more still buried, undiscovered, each one a silent reminder of his meticulous preparations. Keyes admitted that he buried these kits not only for practical reasons, but also because he enjoyed the sense of control they gave him. Knowing that he had weapons and supplies hidden across the country meant that, at any moment, he could kill again. The kits were not just tools. They were symbols of his power, his ability to strike whenever he chose. When questioned about the kits, Keyes revealed his philosophy of randomness. He insisted that he avoided killing close to home and chose victims at random to avoid detection. He would fly into a city, rent a car, and drive hundreds of miles to find his victims. He never hunted in one place too often, and he avoided leaving electronic trails by paying in cash and turning off his cell phone. His kits allowed him to kill without preparation on the surface. It looked spontaneous, but in reality, it was carefully orchestrated years in advance. Law enforcement struggled with the implications of this system. How many kits were still buried? How many had already been used? For every kit found, there could be several more that would never be discovered. The uncertainty was overwhelming. Each time Keyes hinted at another kit, investigators hoped it would lead to answers for families of the missing. But more often than not, he withheld details, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Keyes admitted to at least 11 murders, but the true number remains unknown. He boasted of attacks across the United States, describing victims whose identities he refused to share. He hinted at murders in Washington, New York, Oregon, and beyond. Investigators connected him to disappearances, but without bodies or evidence, many cases remain unsolved. His refusal to name his victims added to the torment of grieving families, many of whom still do not know whether their loved ones were among his targets. The randomness of his killings also means his true victim count may never be known. Most serial killers follow patterns, targeting specific demographics, acting in specific locations, or repeating certain rituals. These patterns allow investigators to connect crimes and build profiles. But Keyes deliberately broke every rule. He killed men and women, young and old, alone or in pairs. He struck in cities, suburbs, and rural areas. He left no signature, no calling card, no ritual. He prided himself on being unpredictable, and for years it worked. What makes the story even more haunting is the way he could blend back into society after a murder. After killing the Curriers in Vermont, he flew back to Alaska and went on with his life as a father, boyfriend, and contractor. No one suspected that while he was spending time with his daughter or building houses, he was also hiding the memories of his crimes and the locations of his kill kits. The duality of his existence allowed him to evade detection for years. During his interrogations, Keyes often smirked when discussing his methods. He took pride in how long he had managed to get away with it. He referred to his crimes as projects, planned with the same detail one might devote to building a house or writing a report. His emotionless tone unnerved investigators. There was no anger, no passion, just calculation. For Keyes, killing was not about rage or revenge. It was about control planning and the satisfaction of executing a flawless crime. The discovery of the kill kits also underscored the frightening reality of how many opportunities he might have had. Each buried kit represented not only a murder he had already committed, but also murders he intended to commit. Investigators believe he may have been planning new attacks even as he was being interrogated. His ability to think years ahead made him one of the most dangerous killers law enforcement had ever encountered. But despite the careful system he built, it was not perfect. Samantha Koenig's abduction and murder broke his rules. By killing close to home and using her debit card across multiple states, he exposed himself. The very precision that had protected him for years was undone by a single set of mistakes. His arrogance in believing he could outsmart investigators ultimately led to his capture. The kill kits remain one of the most disturbing elements of his story because they symbolize the crimes that may never be solved. Each hidden cache raises questions about victims we may never know, families who may never have closure, and the terrifying possibility that more bodies lie undiscovered across the United States. For investigators, the hunt for these kits continues. Each discovery brings a chance to connect Keyes to another unsolved case, but each undiscovered kit is a reminder of how much remains unknown. Israel Keyes' kill kits were not just tools of murder. They were his legacy scattered across the country, a grim testament to his patience, planning, and cruelty. After his arrest in March 2012, Israel Keyes entered a new phase of his life, not as the predator stalking shadows, but as the subject of constant scrutiny. For investigators, his capture was a victory, but it was only the beginning of a complex game. Keyes was unlike most serial killers they had encountered. He was methodical, detached, and eerily self-aware. He knew what they wanted from him: confessions, names of victims, locations of bodies. And he used that knowledge to manipulate, delay, and control every moment of his interrogations. From the start, Keyes dictated the terms of engagement. He would speak when he wanted, about what he wanted, and only under conditions he set. Sometimes it was as simple as requesting a coffee or a cigar. Other times, it was about controlling the narrative, deciding which crimes to reveal and which to keep hidden. He told investigators directly that if they wanted the truth, they needed to keep his case out of the media. Public attention, he said, would make him shut down. The FBI and Anchorage police faced an unprecedented challenge, balancing the need to inform the public with the need to keep Keyes talking. The interrogations revealed the depth of his manipulation. He would sit calmly, often leaning back in his chair, speaking in a measured tone. His words carried no emotion when describing murder. He spoke of strangulation, abduction, and dismemberment as though discussing a construction project. This lack of empathy unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. They were used to killers justifying their crimes with anger, trauma, or obsession. But Keyes offered none of that. He did not kill out of hatred, lust, or revenge. He killed because he wanted to, because he enjoyed the control it gave him. Psychologists who studied Keyes after his arrest saw him as a rare hybrid, a serial killer who combined traits of organized offenders, meticulous in planning, with the unpredictability of disorganized killers who strike at random. He blurred categories, making him difficult to profile. Most killers choose victims who fit a type A: young women, children, sex workers, or specific demographics. Keyes rejected that entirely. For him, randomness was a shield, By refusing to follow patterns, he stayed invisible. His crimes stretched from Washington to Vermont, from Texas to Alaska, leaving investigators with no common thread to tie them together until he confessed. Yet for all his control, the interrogations also revealed cracks in his facade. At times, he displayed arrogance, boasting about how easily he had outsmarted authorities for years. But at other times, frustration bled through. He hated being confined. He despised the idea of losing control over his life. He admitted that the worst part of being caught was no longer being able to kill. Murder, he said, was a part of him, something he had built his life around. Without it, he felt powerless. Keyes was highly intelligent, and he used that intelligence to manipulate not just investigators, but the system itself. He bargained constantly. He promised to reveal more victims if certain conditions were met. He dangled the possibility of closure for families, but pulled it back when he felt slighted. He refused to give names, saying that keeping the victims anonymous was his way of maintaining control, even in captivity. In one chilling moment, he told investigators, "I'll tell you everything, but only if you play by my rules." For the FBI, this was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. On one hand, Keyes was willing to talk, something rare for a serial killer. On the other hand, he revealed only fragments, forcing investigators into a psychological tug-of-war. They had to keep him comfortable enough to speak, yet pressured enough to yield useful information. Every session was a balancing act, and Keyes seemed to relish the power it gave him. One of the most disturbing aspects of the interrogations was Keyes' awareness of his own psychology. He admitted freely that he had been fascinated by killers since adolescence. He studied them, learning what mistakes they made and how to avoid them. He prided himself on being different, smarter, more disciplined, more patient. He described murder not as an uncontrollable urge, but as a calculated act, something he planned months or even years in advance. To him, killing was not about compulsion but choice. That made him even more dangerous. Investigators probed his past, searching for trauma, abuse, or a trigger that might explain his actions. But Keyes rejected those narratives. He admitted to being raised in a strict and isolated environment, but he insisted that his choices were his own. He wanted to kill because it gave him power and satisfaction, not because of any external cause. This lack of remorse or justification baffled and horrified psychologists. He was, in their view, a predator who killed simply because he enjoyed it. Keyes also revealed the depth of his long-term planning. He explained how he would travel thousands of miles, bury kill kits, and wait years before using them. He described in detail how he selected victims, randomly, based on opportunity. He admitted to killing couples to reduce the chance of leaving a surviving witness. He discussed how he studied police methods, ensuring he stayed ahead of detection. Each detail reinforced the terrifying reality that his crimes could stretch far beyond the known 11 murders. Despite his control, investigators began to sense desperation in Keyes as time went on. He feared losing relevance, feared that once the media lost interest, no one would care about his story. He wanted recognition, but only on his terms. This internal conflict, the desire to be remembered but the refusal to give details, defined his final months. He wanted to be a mystery, a shadowy figure whose full legacy would never be known. The interrogations left investigators with haunting questions. How many victims were there truly? Where were the bodies hidden? How many families were still living in agony, unaware that their loved one had fallen prey to Keyes? Each hint he dropped opened new avenues of investigation, but each refusal slammed the door shut again. He controlled the flow of information like a faucet, turning it on and off as he pleased. For law enforcement, Israel Keyes became not just a case, but a study in manipulation. He demonstrated how a killer could evade detection for years through planning, patience, and randomness. He showed how someone could live a double life so convincingly that even those closest to him never suspected the truth. And in his interrogations, he proved that even in chains, he could still wield power over others. Keyes' psychology defied easy labels. He was not the frenzied killer driven by compulsion, nor the charismatic manipulator who lured victims with charm. He was cold, deliberate, and chillingly ordinary on the surface. He built a life where he could be a father, a partner, a neighbor, and also a predator capable of unimaginable cruelty. That duality, combined with his refusal to give closure, ensured that even in death, his shadow would linger. By late 2012, Israel Keyes' time was running out. He sat in custody in Anchorage, Alaska, facing charges for the abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig. Investigators knew they had their man, but they also knew the larger story was far from complete. Keyes himself admitted to at least 11 murders, yet he refused to give names or locations. Each interrogation became a test of patience, a battle of wills between law enforcement, desperate for answers, and a killer determined to control the narrative until the very end. Keyes understood the system well. He knew that once his trial began, the evidence would spill into the public record. He despised the idea of losing control of his story. He made it clear that he wanted to avoid the spectacle of a trial, insisting he would plead guilty if certain conditions were met. But those conditions, such as keeping his crimes out of the media and promising a swift execution, were demands the system could not accommodate. He wanted the ultimate paradox to be remembered and feared as a shadowy figure, yet also to vanish quickly without the world dissecting him. While investigators pressed him for more information, Keyes remained unpredictable. At times, he seemed on the verge of revealing more victims. At other times, he shut down entirely. He hinted at murders in Washington, Oregon, Vermont, and New York, but rarely gave details. He teased investigators with fragments, like puzzle pieces he refused to assemble. For families of the missing, these hints were agonizing. They offered the possibility of closure, but never delivered it. Keyes knew this, and in his own way, he seemed to relish it. As the months passed, investigators became increasingly concerned that Keyes would never reveal the full truth. He had already expressed his desire to avoid a lengthy trial. He hinted that he had no intention of spending the rest of his life in prison. In his mind, the only way to maintain control was to end his life on his own terms. And in December 2012, he followed through. On December 2, 2012, Israel Keyes was found dead in his Anchorage jail cell. He had slit his wrists and strangled himself with a makeshift ligature, ensuring his death. For the investigators who had spent months trying to extract information from him, his suicide was both an ending and a cruel denial. With him died the answers to countless questions, names of victims, locations of bodies, and the full scope of his crimes. But Keyes did not leave quietly. In his cell, investigators found a note, what some called a suicide letter, though it read less like a confession and more like a cryptic poem. It was filled with rambling imagery about death, darkness, and an afterlife. It contained no apologies, no mention of specific crimes, and no acknowledgement of his victims. Instead, it was a final act of manipulation, a message designed to frustrate and confuse. Even in death, he refused to give closure to the families he had devastated. The suicide note reinforced what investigators had long suspected: Israel Keyes did not want justice, nor did he care about the pain he caused. His crimes were not about passion or compulsion, but control. By killing himself, he denied the system the opportunity to sentence him. By writing a note without details, he denied victims' families the closure they deserved. His final act was consistent with his life: cold, calculated, and cruel. In the aftermath of his death, investigators tried to piece together what they could. They scoured his travel records, his financial history, and his known kill kits. They linked him definitively to the murder of Samantha Koenig and the Curriers in Vermont, along with a few other cases. But beyond that, the trail was fragmentary. Keyes had traveled extensively across the continental United States, into Canada, and even to Mexico. Each trip was a potential crime scene. Each journey raised the possibility of victims who remain unidentified to this day. The FBI took the unusual step of publicly appealing to the public after his death. They released timelines of his known movements, asking families of missing persons to come forward. They warned that Keyes may have killed far more than the 11 victims he admitted to. For some families, this offered hope of answers. For others, it deepened the uncertainty. Was their missing loved one of Keyes' victims? Or would the truth remain forever buried with him? Psychologists and criminologists continue to study Israel Keyes as one of the most unique serial killers in modern history. Unlike many infamous killers, he lacked a clear pattern, fetish, or victim type. He broke every mold. He did not kill for attention or notoriety, yet he still craved control over how he was perceived. He killed at random, across vast distances, using kill kits buried years in advance. His crimes were a chilling blend of patience, discipline, and cold-blooded cruelty. His suicide cemented his legacy, not as a figure of resolution, but of unanswered questions. He left behind a trail of mysteries that may never be solved. Families of the missing still wonder if he was responsible. Investigators still search for connections between his travels and unsolved cases, and his name continues to haunt discussions of criminal psychology. Not for what we know, but for what we will never know. For the families of Samantha Koenig and Bill and Lorraine Currier, the loss was irreparable. They received some answers, but not all. For countless other families across the United States, the uncertainty continues. Keyes ensured that by dying, he would maintain control of the truth forever. In the end, Israel Keyes represents one of the darkest possibilities of human nature. A killer who operated without boundaries, without patterns, and without remorse. He was a predator who blended into ordinary life, a father and partner by day, a murderer by night. He left behind not only victims but also questions that investigators, psychologists, and families still struggle to answer. His story is not one of resolution but of shadows. Israel Keyes' legacy is not measured in convictions or trials, but in the haunting uncertainty he left behind. His death silenced his voice, but it also preserved his secrets, and perhaps that was his final victory, ensuring that, even in death, he would remain a mystery.